Rick Van Acker from University of Illinois in Chicago, and he's going to be speaking to us about developing behavior intervention plans. We're going to be focusing a little more on case studies, and I think that's going to give everybody a chance to do a little more practice.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, when we were getting ready for this, they said, well, let's do a nice case study and see if we get people a chance to get involved and work on some things and see how they can interpret data and develop plans and this kind of stuff. But before we get started, I thought you've been doing this now for a number of Ideally, we're going to have a little bit of time to spend. For example, one of the things that I find people oftentimes struggling with is that I can do the functional assessment and all of a sudden, yeah, maybe I identify a function, but now what do I do? How does that translate into the behavior intervention plan and make use of the function? So I don't know what kind of issues, but what issues are you guys facing? What do you want to make sure we talk about today? You're giving up a day to come here? What are issues? Yeah.
The problem I'm having is getting my peers to buy into, you do all this, you write the plan, but in a middle school setting, you've got to have 6 teachers all doing the same thing the same way, and I'm just a peer, I'm just a fellow teacher. It's hard to get everyone to buy into it.
Okay.
If you want them to.
All right.
Strategies to gather on board.
Okay. So issues in terms of how to get people on board. Let me ask you, are other people seeing the same sort of thing? Okay. Anybody found some ways to make that work better? Don't everybody raise your hand at once. Yes?
Try to make it part of the development.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's probably one of the best ways that I've found is that as you sit down, and we're going to play a little bit today, but let's say that I sit down and I say, okay, here are some of the things that we need to collect data on. So maybe we've got to do a parent interview. We want to interview the student. We want to observe a science class. Whatever might be going on. Can I involve them somehow in that process? Now, in some cases, I've actually gone in and filled in for a teacher to free them up to go observe another teacher. Now, 2 things happen when you do that. One is that teachers tend to learn a lot more about intervention when they watch another teacher than any time when you're trying to tell them. So all of a sudden, especially, how many of you have gone in and seen that teacher behavior plays a role in the student's behavior? Yeah, it's almost always. One of the things that I've found is that oftentimes if I can have one of their colleagues observe them and kind of focus it so that one of the things we want to look at are what are the consequences? How do teachers address when he talks out, if talking out is a problem? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to all of a sudden realize that we are, every now and then we're reinforcing this kid for talking out and it's like, bing, a light goes on. So oftentimes if I can do that, it's going to be a lot better for buy-in if I can get them to be involved in the process. I generally find that you've got to find some way to release them to be able to do that. So whether the school has people that you can do that, most teachers are not going to sacrifice one of their planning periods to go in and do this. But oftentimes that will be a real help. Somebody else had their hand up.
One of the issues that I'm facing is the district themselves are clueless, I would say, in terms of implement or doing the actual, because we have all ours on the computer on Eastbed, and it's, what I've been trained and used to is this way, and I completely had to change my thinking and do it on the computer, which is different, and the issue of how they go about it. It's not the same of what we legally should be doing. If you see what I'm saying.
Okay.
Without, they like to do things a little bit differently. Okay.
In what way are they doing it different than, I mean, oftentimes schools have different forms. The state of Illinois has the form that it recommends, and oftentimes districts will have their own forms that, in some cases, may or may not be.
I think it's with the parent getting involved.
Okay.
It's different. The setup of the meeting to implement the plan is different. The whole process is different than what I've been trained to do.
Okay. All right. So part of it may be getting some administrators aware of the process in terms of what's going on.
I think it's all about education.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping.
They skip the FBA. They completely, like, the kid gets suspended, immediately they want to FIP the next week. Right. So they're skipping the process of
well, that is a little different, isn't it?
They don't get that. That's what she's expecting.
Okay.
And she and I are in the same district. And I also, another issue that comes up is when a student comes back from a suspension, right away they want a BIP. You know, or they come in from a private placement, right away they want a BIP. And they skip the whole FBA, and they skip the whole thing, and it could be a suspension for one thing that is, you know, not the student's character, it just happened to be a big mistake. They want a BIP done, and so we're struggling trying to, you know, what are we going to write a BIP about, or the FBA, and that's why we have an FBA, and determine if we need, you know,
okay.
So it's just complicated.
All right. Yeah, I mean, part of the, you know, part of the dilemma, I think, is that oftentimes if you read, you know, special education law, the relationship of the BIP and the FBA, it's very clear if you get to that 10th day of suspension. The piece where it's the child's behavior interferes with his learning or the learning of others, it says they have to have a BIP. Elsewhere in the law it says the BIP is supposed to be informed by a functional assessment of behavior, but it's not in the same paragraph. And so oftentimes people look at this and say, oh, well, if it's not the 10-day thing, we don't need to mess with this FBA. We just need a behavior intervention plan. And so oftentimes it is a matter of educating people. It's also the issue of that if I want to develop a behavior intervention plan that has a halfway decent chance of actually addressing the behavior, understanding how that behavior serves the student, how the factors in the context of the school either set to occasion the behavior or support the behavior is going to be critical to developing a good plan. Otherwise, you're just kind of shooting in the dark. And we've been doing that for a long time and found that it's not terribly effective in many cases. Sometimes you hit, you're okay, but for a lot of kids, that's just not going to get what's going on. Now, how many of you have actually been working with a kid and you find, I can't find a function? Ever happen? Yeah, I find that oftentimes I'll go in, or it's like, you know, if I take this data, okay, I've got 3 pieces of data that all say it's for, you know, to escape the task. But if I took 2 more pieces of data, I'd find it some, you know, it's like I'm finding all kinds of functions, and I'm not really comfortable that any of these are really tapping into what's going on. One of the things I oftentimes find is that it's not the function that's the most powerful piece of helping me understand what's going on. It's the antecedents and the consequences. So while I might not know why David here is engaging the behavior he's engaging in, I can see that what Jill is doing as a response has no hope whatsoever of changing David's behavior. Okay? It's feeding right into supporting that behavior. So while I may not be comfortable that I've got the function nailed down, I am very comfortable that I can make a better intervention plan from the standpoint of the consequence in a way that probably is not going to, you know, at least encourage David's, further engagement of that behavior. So sometimes it's a little, you know, there's other things besides just the function that you gain from it that makes it worthwhile to do. And educators oftentimes can get into that. Administrators even, you know, it doesn't take much of an administrator to realize that teacher behavior plays a role in student behavior. And so if you talk about the fact that one of the things the functional assessment does that allows us to go in and explore teacher behavior and to begin to give teachers help and support in being more effective with their interventions with kids. Sometimes parents and administrators will buy into that. Other questions or issues that, yeah?
Getting teachers to buy into taking measurable data. They're so used to saying, yeah, it works, no, it doesn't work at a meeting. And I always say, well, I need the data to show me that. And sometimes they don't take that accurate data. You know, when I remember it, I remember it. When I don't, I don't.
Mm-hmm. There's probably the biggest challenge that I see at almost any school is that, and quite frankly, right now, we are asking teachers to do too much. And, you know, one more thing is probably one more thing that's 10 more things too many. So I think one of the big issues becomes, have I given some thought to the fact that the data I want to collect is practical? Is this practical for teachers to be able to do this? And in many cases, I think we ask teachers to take too much data. Oftentimes, by sampling and probing, I can get as much of a picture of is this effective as I can by saying, I want data for every time this kid does this. The reality is, they're not going to do it every time. You know, but I might be willing to take, you know, a 20-minute probe, you know, a couple of times a week or whatever. You know, And if it's, the other thing I've found, at least for me, if the data collection process is not physically on the teacher, it isn't going to happen. Okay, so if I have to go over to a notepad or go over someplace else, it's probably not going to happen. So oftentimes I'll have the tape on the person's arm, I'll have some kind of a clicker kind of a thing, you know, that the person has, so that it's right here. Because while I may want to, I'm over here working with these students. Okay, she just did it. I've got to mark this down, or whatever's going on, or you know, they did the appropriate behavior. I want to mark that down. I forget to go do it. So, you know, and we'll talk about that. In fact, that's a big part of what we're going to do today. Is we're going to talk about what data would we collect to identify the functions and stuff, but then we're going to talk about the behavior intervention plans, and we'll talk a little bit about how would you begin to set up ways to capture information to say, is this effective? Okay.
I just want to say, I'm coming from Plainfield, we got 28,000 students and we're growing like really, really fast. And the FBA process has been a huge challenge, and especially with students placed all over the district. When our hearing itinerants are going from building to building, the process it's different from building to building. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's kind of thrown on my shoulders. I'm the behavior specialist for the district, and we've got you know, we send it through our attorney and everything else like that. Our forms are trying to make things as simple as possible, user-friendly, data collection is, you know, as easy as possible. And I know one of the questions earlier was, you know, how do you get your teachers to buy it? Because that's a huge one. It's especially in the middle school and the high schools where they teach a subject instead of a child, you know, and it really comes down to how do we get them to just not give them more work to do, but kind of change the way what they do. You know, in other words, you know, change the energy that they're putting into 45 redirections, sending them out, and all that other stuff, into some of this more proactive, preventative kind of interventions. But listening to everybody, and after doing this for a couple of years, we're improving. I mean, we're getting there. But unfortunately, and it goes back to, I think, what this young lady was saying over the laws, you know, really taking a look at exactly. When you've got a kid who's coming back from a 10-day suspension, he's got to have a behavior intervention plan based on the law, and that has to happen from, you've got to do a functional behavior assessment. If it is just that one acute behavior, you still have to do it for that, you know, those kinds of things. And that's what we run into, is kind of, I guess, when I'm trying to make a long story even longer.
You want to work at a university? We like that at universities.
It's really kind of more of the semantics of all of it that kind of is kind of getting in the way, and trying. What we're trying to do is simplify it as much as possible, but to be valuable, the tool to be as valuable as possible.
Right. I think it was last year, or when I was here, I think one of the things for me that it's probably the most challenging piece of this, but also the most powerful if you can do it, is that willingness to actually go in to look at teacher behavior. Again, it's a rare situation that I don't see the teacher plays a role in the student's behavior. I'm not going to say every time, but you know, the teacher is such a major part of the context. And oftentimes for kids whose behavior is such that we have to do an FBA, what the teacher's currently doing is not particularly effective. And if I can give teachers accurate information, non-judgmental, you know, in terms of nothing, you know, boy, what the heck what were you thinking, you know, but help them understand that, you know, you are putting an incredible amount of work into trying to address the problems with this child, but you're doing it in such a way that it will probably never be effective. And that's been my experience. Usually when I go in, it is not for lack of effort. The teacher is, you know, like you're saying, you know, this is the 45th reprimand. That's a lot of work to stop teaching and reprimand this kid 20, 30 times, which isn't rare. And you go, okay, now you just broke up the lesson 30 times. It's not effective. Okay? Now the problem is, it's effective for a very short period of time. So if I go, Jill will usually, okay, I'll quiet down right now for about a minute and a half, and then I'm back into it again. And what I see is that I'm actually engaging more and more and more. And we do know that if you want to go into a classroom and count one thing in the fall of the year, teacher reprimand is the best predictor of more reprimand in the spring. So if I go into a high reprimand classroom in the fall, it will be even more reprimand in the spring. We'll lose even more instructional time. Now, again, because it works for that short period of time, I somehow think this is an effective strategy. And at least it keeps me sane. Otherwise, I'm going to go tear Jill's head off, right? Okay? At least she shuts up for a minute. God is in their heaven. I'm ready to go, you know? And it's how do I begin to give teachers feedback of that this is a lot of work for not a lot of payoff. Let's get that energy out. Let's not do this stuff that doesn't work anymore, and let's do something else. Many of us are not comfortable with conflict. So the last thing I want to do is talk to David about what he may be doing that's less than effective. I'll just talk about what else he could do. Well, then we're just piling things on top of things on top of things, and we're not taking anything off the plate. So there's a piece of it that I think, unfortunately, you've got to be somewhat comfortable with conflict, and you've got to be somewhat comfortable and respectful enough of the teachers that you're working with to realize they probably can accept. You're giving them clear feedback about this is not an effective strategy. Let's do this instead. You know, you're putting, in fact, I'll see teachers literally just kind of go, when you finally say, my God, you are putting a lot of work into this, you know, but it's not particularly effective. Yes! Well, let's stop doing that. You know, it's kind of like that joke about the guy who goes to the doctor and says, you know, when I move my arm like this, it hurts. The doctor says, well, quit moving it like that, right? To a certain extent, we've got to be that doctor who says, you know, stop doing this and let's do something else that may be more effective. Okay? What else is, yeah?
Well, SRC, I think, could also, you know, maybe, I'm just thinking about trying to tie in the administration, which is one of the issues that we have here, and teacher cooperation. You know, you've got teachers of various levels of experience and cooperation. They want to get excited and work with you or they don't. And most of them are pretty much going to be forced to have a requirement by their administrator to get involved or a form to fill out of some kind, I'm thinking. So maybe ISRC could write more articles in our newsletter about maybe like situations where districts have been caught without the FDA and the consequences of that, or something that, you know, and other articles that the teachers could use to kind of show, heck, to the administrator, you know, look how this is beneficial, because it's been certainly very difficult in some districts when some parents went to due process and they had no paperwork to back up what they were saying. Because right now the school's only required to have it done. They're not required to have it done well. It's kind of like the transition plan. And so as long as they've got it in place, that's really what they're requiring, you know, a lot of schools and some people. So I think ISRC could be assisted in that way too.
Actually, though, in due process hearings, they actually are being asked to do it well. And in fact, if you want a focus of the article for that kind of thing, I mean, and I think I've mentioned this before, but this is the Achilles heel of most school districts. If you talk to Matt Cohen and some of the lawyers that tend to be parent lawyers, they are very clear that one of the first questions they will ask a parent whose child is IEP child, does your child have a BIP and an FBA? If they don't, they'll say, should they? Does your child have behavior problems? Okay. What they're going to do is go after you that you should have had one and you didn't develop one, or even better, you've got one. Okay, because the odds are it's not done well. Okay, and so it's almost a slam dunk for a lawyer to get this to be found to be, you know, an inadequate FBA and a BIP. Now, why would that be a good thing for a parent's lawyer to have? Why would they want to win on an item like this? If I'm a parent's lawyer, why is that important to me?
Going to get at least partial money.
That's right. The district is going to pay at least a part of my salary. All I've got to do is win on something in this case, and part of my salary is going to be covered. This is, again, I mean, the number of due process hearings in which the FBA or the BIP have been drawn into the issue, and that the school has been found to have done an appropriate job, is a very minuscule portion of the due process hearings. So this becomes one of those, the odds are I'll win this. The odds are you will have not done an adequate job, or you will not have actually implemented the BIP that you've developed. And if I subpoena a bunch of teachers and start asking them questions about what they're supposed to be doing, they're going to sound like they're a bunch of idiots, because they won't have read it, they won't know what's going on, they won't be able to define the behavior. And I'll say, well, there's no question why this kid's behavior is still a problem. Heck, the teachers didn't even know what they were doing. And I've won. So, you know, I think from that standpoint, the scare kind of a thing is pretty easy, you know, argument to make with administrators. The problem comes down to that this is not a quick and easy process. And there's not a lot of time, and schools are even, you know, getting more in a bind. I think the other, at least looming out there, is the idea that the Office of Equal Rights really wants to make this a school issue, not a special ed issue. They want to see FBAs and BIPs for all kids because there's another group of students that are being suspended and expelled at rates higher than what would be anticipated, and that's students of color, especially African American males. So they are really trying to get this to be every child would have a BIP and an FBA and a BIP if we got to that 10-day kind of a thing, the same kind of situations that we're dealing now with special education. They're saying it's not a special ed. This is an educational issue. I don't know what we'd do then, because we can't even do.
We've actually done that. Our FBA BIP process is more of a regular ed initiative, because if you're looking at, you know, the eligibility for special education when it comes to behavior issues, citizenship, whatever, you know, the questions that are asked,
right.
You basically have to have those things
right.
in place already.
Yep.
So it's really become a regular ed initiative in our district, but obviously following like a flex process and so on, so that it's not the first thing we jump to, you know, kind
right.
of. So there isn't 400 FBAs and BIPs going on in a building.
Yeah.
Some are a little crazy, but others, you know what I'm saying? But actually, yeah, we've already started doing that.
Right.
This is becoming more from the regular ed initiative.
Yeah, and I think a lot of schools are doing that. And I think things like RTI and PBIS, I mean, an awful lot of things are converging into the kind of the same situation of saying, look at folks, you know, we've probably got to have multiple layers here of services and supports and helps and identify these kids early before there's big problems. So all of this kind of is coming together, but it's a challenge for schools.
At our school, we have some kids who are obviously ADHD, and the parents don't want their kids medicated or they don't want them labeled. So they won't cooperate, and then the teachers get frustrated because the students keep doing the same behaviors over and over. And no matter how many times you suspend them or they go to the office, it just continues. And as they get older, then they just say, well, pretty soon they'll be in 8th grade, so then they'll graduate and they'll be somebody else's problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've hit probably 3 big problems here. First, one is the issue of, if I am ADHD and I am engaged in challenging behaviors, will going to the office and being suspended assist me in dealing with my behavior? Probably not. I mean, one of the issues it sounds like, and I think that oftentimes schools don't understand issues like ADHD, bipolar, something. I mean, if you think that, you know, if the statistics are correct and 1 in 5 kids in front of you in the classroom has a diagnosable mental health problem, we've got some pretty significant issues out there. And they say about 1 in 10 that this is serious enough to be, you know, interfering with things that are going on. Not all of these kids will qualify for special education. In fact, a large number of them will not, because academically they can still do pretty well. ADHD is a, you know, they engage in behaviors that make us crazy. The 2 things you do not want to be in the Illinois or in the public schools of this country is ADHD or bipolar. Okay? Neither of those disorders do well whatsoever in our schools, because we expect kids to engage in behaviors that these disorders just fly in the face of it. So I think one of the issues becomes probably not going to punish a kid out of ADHD. So what am I going to have to do to deal with the behavior and help teachers become more aware and capable of making the kinds of adjustments in classrooms that might make these kids more successful? And it's probably going to be, the nice thing about it is that it's more teaching them than disciplining them. And so it kind of fits better with what teachers already know. The problem is that the behavior annoys me. I don't want to teach you. I want to punish you out of it. So we've got to shift that philosophy. The second thing I think that falls into it is the fact that, and we may have talked about this before, one of the big problems with ADHD is that we go medication. You put the kid on medication. Only about 1/3 of kids with ADHD actually respond to medication well. Another 1/3 will respond for a short period of time to the medication, and then it will lose its effectiveness. And a full 1/3, medication is not the answer whatsoever. Doesn't have much of an impact at all. So this idea that, you know, medicate them and life will be good, I think we also have to realize that that's probably not the panacea that we'd like it to be. The other piece of that is that oftentimes the person who talks with the doctor is the parent. Now, especially if I'm using the stimulant medication like Ritalin or something like that, there's a lot of different medications out there now, but especially if I'm using the stimulant medication, parents, the reason I give the child a stimulant is because I want to increase his ability to attend. I do not want enough medication to impact his behavior. I want him to be able to attend and be alert so that he can learn, and then I am going to utilize behavioral interventions to deal with the behavior, because now he's in a better place to learn the contingencies, to make sense out of this. Unfortunately, we're just now starting to find some of the cognitive behavioral interventions that are effective with ADHD. That hasn't been a real big toolbox for that population because they don't use that internal voice very well. But we're starting to find some breakthrough kinds of areas in that too now. But from the behavioral standpoint, now the problem is that mom and dad want the kid to behave. They're not working with their child in terms of, gee, you know what, I think Lori is attending better now. All right? They want to know, can I take her to grandma, to grandma's house and not have her take apart the VCR? Right? So when I tell the doctor, yes, she has enough medication, it's when the behavior is impacted. By the time I have enough medication to impact the behavior, I have so dulled the child's ability to learn that they're over-medicated. And I am far more likely to get the side effect kinds of issues and the things that parents oftentimes respond. I tried this medication. My kid they wouldn't sleep. They had, they were eating like, there was no tomorrow, or they weren't eating at all. All those side effect kinds of problems are more pronounced when I over-medicate. So one is that if you've even got a kid with ADHD that's being medicated, if they're working on the medication, always make sure, see if you can't get that the doctor sends you some kind of a checklist, as the teachers, to say, how are they doing? Because you are in a much better place to deal with that than parents are.
One of the things that I often recommend around the state and suggest constantly is there is no connect between the family, because I go with the family sometimes, to see the psychiatrist. They've waited for an hour and a half in the waiting room. They're exhausted. The kids have been running around. By the time they get in for their 10 minutes with the psychiatrist and he says, how things go, and they go, okay. So I ask the teacher, every time write a paragraph the day before with numbers that tell the psychiatrist, that describe the behavior in the classroom. And I really work at setting up a constant communication with the teacher and the psychiatrist, because the psychiatrist has no information about how long, how many seconds, how many times in a minute does the child do that. And by then getting the note every time, there's a comparison. Right.
Yeah, that's a much better process if you can get the parents to agree to allow you to. Oftentimes parents don't want you to talk to their medical people, and that can be a trust issue, and then you've got to go and work on those issues.
And just kind of saying, and I find this population to be very difficult in the junior high, and for this reason said, and also because parents, some come in and then use that as the excuse for Johnny's behavior. Right. And so it's, that really lowers our impact on anything we're trying to do when nothing is being followed at home. And then if you've got the student who's saying, well, I have ADHD, so therefore I'm out of it. And I understand we're still going to expect the behavior that we're expecting, but it makes it really almost impossible. And so it's very frustrating. We come to things, we hear this, we try to implement it and do all this, and the parent sits in a meeting, won't share information, won't, try medication perhaps long enough. I mean, their part in this whole procedure, is little. And yet if things aren't going their way, or if it gets to the point where somebody's being put out in a program or moved to a different program or that, then we will be the ones sitting at the table having to answer what we've done. Right. And the parents don't have that same level of accountability in some way. So to me it gets frustrating, that the whole system.
And I think that one of the when you talk with staff or when you talk with parents, all the skills you would use in working with a child who has significant behavior problems in terms of helping them understand what's going on, and I find that I use all those very skills in terms of what's going on. Part of the issue of empathizing with the parents, if I have a child with ADHD What has that child's preschool program looked like? What kind of messages was this kid probably getting a lot during preschool?
I can tell you from personal experience, they're bad.
Yeah.
In fact, my son almost got kicked out of preschool for the fact that he had ADHD, and they did not know how to deal with his behavior, didn't want to take any suggestions. All they knew is that he could not nap for 2.5 hours, so therefore he must go. They don't understand, like, you don't understand, he didn't even nap when he was 2 days old.
Right.
You're wanting him to nap for 2.5 hours.
I'll nap. You take him, I'll nap, we'll all be happy. Yeah, oftentimes, you go in and like the level of reprimand, sit down, stop it, no, don't. By the time these kids are through preschool, they already know school's not for them. Whatever this thing is called school, I don't do it well. Okay, and then we continue to move them through the process. What they get oftentimes is a very, very negative experience in terms of what they're supposed to be doing. Partially because schools generally follow a punishment paradigm. Okay? Now, one of the things that we're beginning to see is that there's a high comorbidity between ADHD, it's kind of becoming an ADHD session, ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. One of the things that's, at least when you start looking at some of the research that's coming out now and they look at some of the causal links, we probably play a major role as school people in the development of that oppositional defiant disorder because we keep trying to punish them out of their disorder. If you punish a person long enough, they tend to become oppositional and defiant. Okay? So as they get older and move towards middle school, now they've got, now they're not just dealing with ADHD, now we're also dealing sometimes with some oppositional defiant kinds of things thrown on there, and if we push far enough, it'll be conduct disorder. But so they're not oftentimes fun kids to work with sometimes in schools in terms of asking them to do stuff. Again, we keep trying to use punishment. Oftentimes, by the time the parent comes to you, why I want to make excuses is because I haven't felt you guys have, for even 5 minutes, have understood what ADHD is all about. So yes, I'm coming to the defense of my child. All right? So part of it is that I think we have to peel some of that back and work with parents. If you are utilizing high levels of punishment, expect the parent to come in ready to fight. If you are teaching, using positive reinforcement for desired behaviors, attempting to try to get the child to engage in things and trap them into tasks, probably a lot better. Now, I find that oftentimes parents read the first half of the book and not the second half of the book. And I'll say, yes, your child has a hard time, in terms of staying, focused in situations. They attend to everything. And because of that, the cause and effect aspect has to be even more predictable than it does with a typical child, not less predictable. Which means now I've got to follow through every time, as much as I possibly can, because it's going to be harder for your child to connect these things. Now, again, if I'm connecting those things to positives, I'm probably not going to get the same fight as if I'm trying to connect those things to negatives. Okay? Now, there may be some punishment aspects in any child's program. And that there's nothing, that's fine. That should not be where you're trying to get all your movement. Unfortunately, I think too often when we look at our behavior intervention plans, not that they're necessarily written that way, but if we watch them be carried out, oftentimes the negative pieces of our plans are much more subscribed to than the positive sides of our plans. So we've got to, I think those become real key issues. And we'll talk about that this afternoon when we start looking at developing plans. That whole positive behavioral interventions, the other problem with this with teachers is that it's, when you misbehave, I'm immediately aware of it. When you do what you're supposed to do, I've got to keep that in mind. It's a lot easier to have a program that works on punishment from the standpoint of triggering teacher response, but it's just not going to get us where we want to go. Those are major, major philosophical shifts that this whole process is calling upon that aren't necessarily in place in schools.
When you're doing your functional assessment as this hypothesis of behavioral function when you're dealing with a child who's impulsive because of ADHD, how do you write a hypothesis of behavioral function for an ADHD child? I mean, usually we're used to, attention, escape, constant item, whatever. So how would you hypothesize on the functional behavior?
Well, even if I'm, I mean, the two are not necessarily, because I have some biological aspects to my behavior, doesn't mean that I also haven't learned functions to the behavior. So they're not mutually exclusive. But there are going to be times where, and this is one of the problems of the two things you never want to see made are laws and sausage. The FBA process clearly comes from a behavioral paradigm. Okay? Now, it wasn't that Skinner didn't believe things happened internally. The problem was that you couldn't see them. And then if you read Skinner, he recognized that. It's just that the science of behaviorism says since we can't measure it, see it, taste it, feel it, all those kinds of things, we're going to try to not consider it because we want to, he was hoping to get the behavioral sciences somewhat on league with some of the hard sciences. So one of the dilemmas is that this model focuses very much on observable, kinds of behaviors. There are issues that go on inside. And I think that somehow, some cases, you just, there's depending on what form you use, some forms will talk about, are there any physical, medical kinds of issues. Oftentimes there I might put in, this is a child who has a diagnosis of ADHD so there's some impulsive kinds of situations. So that plays into the fact that this is a kid who's probably may not focus on all the cues that are happening. He may respond in ways that are far in excess of what's going on. If I've got a kid with Asperger's, one of the things we know in Asperger's is that the amygdala of the brain is highly impacted. And so emotion recognition, emotion management, emotion control are all highly impacted biologically. Okay? So that's a factor. Now, there still may be triggers, there still may be consequences that the behavior plays out. One of the things that I find oftentimes is that we teach kids inappropriate behaviors as a response to their biological issues. So if I've got the kid who's fidgeting, moving around, all this kind of stuff, I start reprimanding him, he starts fidgeting even more. Ultimately, I send him out of the room or something else. Pretty soon he learns, you know what? If I don't really like to do this task, I'll just start doing this, and I learn that I can get sent out of the room. This is especially, I find this like in classrooms where children with autism are being brought in, especially kids who are lower functioning children with autism are being brought into general education classrooms. And so the class is doing something this kid may not understand. And so pretty soon the kid's going, ah, ah, ah. And the aide's going, shh, shh, quiet, let's get to work, get to work. You got the picture cue and the whole thing. Ah! What's going to happen ultimately if I keep doing that? Yeah, I get to go for a walk, right? So the aide takes me for a walk around the school. Now, I don't have to be particularly bright to realize I don't understand this, but I like the hall, right? And so pretty soon, while that was not the intent of the behavior, the function of the behavior to begin with, guess what we've just done? We have just taught the child a new function for this behavior, and now we've got something we've got to work with in an FBA.
Yeah, and definitely those are not my problem areas. My problem areas are the impulsive behaviors based on the fact that the child did not pick up on the environmental cues. Mm-hmm. So when I write a hypothesis, do I just write something about his physical difficulties or his biological, neurological difficulties because of ADHD?
The bottom line, probably, I mean, my right, and we can open it up to what other people are doing. I think part of it, what I generally do is I'll talk about that. Now, that would be part of what I would look for in the antecedents. It might be part of what I look for in an interview. I might ask the child, what did you see, what was going on? And what I find is that he can't accurately tell me what's happening. He's not picking up on these kinds of things. And he is then engaged in some kind of behavior. Now, that behavior might be escape behavior, it might be attention behavior, but it's because he didn't read this in the front end. Now, that becomes a really critical piece of the process of developing the behavior intervention plan. One of the things that I'm finding, at least for me, that I'm doing far more now than I probably did when we first started this process of FBA, is building some of the cognitive behavioral interventions. Because it's an applied behavior analysis model, oftentimes we want to just use applied behavior analysis solutions. But for some kids, teaching some self-regulation kind of strategies and some of those kinds of things become very critical components of that front-end piece in terms of helping kids deal with things.
You want to be really careful about how you write things down, and I've had people often write the antecedent as impulse, and I say, how do you prove that to me? I think that's a guess, and so we could put down unknown or seems to be impulsive, but we can't because we don't have a degree in most cases to say they have this or that. You want to be very careful with the wording. You say it seems like something or similar to a child with something, but you don't want to write down anything that you're really not qualified to make a guess.
Yeah, we're not medical doctors. And again, part of that is that if I believe that, can I get at some of that by interviews, by talking with the parent, by talking with the child, are we seeing a pattern where he's not understanding what's going on, or that that these kind of things are things he just seems to miss, So that becomes where you're getting the data to draw from, as opposed to that you're just pulling it out of your head. You're taking it from reports that other people have made in terms of this is an issue, this is a kid who does not pay attention to what's going on before he acts.
Is the question still, I'm trying to think about, I think the question still is like, what is the hypothesis? And do I say then, as an example, with the ADHD kid, that the hypothesis is the function of this behavior is to obtain immediate gratification? You know what I mean? Based on, the impulsivity. In other words, I've got, the filter's not there, boom, I want this, I do it this way or whatever. Is that kind of what you're asking?
And so we can just kind of put maybe immediate gratification.
But that's the function is he's gaining something, right? He's getting something that he wants. So the impulsivity or whatever it is that you're anticipating, whatever some of those biological things, some of the children with autism, we know there's stuff going on. I can't see and feel that. I think that plays a role in it, so I think it's important to talk about the fact that this child may have that diagnosis if they have it, because I think that helps us understand what things are going on. It also allows us to tap into intervention strategies that have been shown to be effective with the population. But it's what is the result of that in observable behavior? How does that play out for this kid? Does it result in his getting attention? Does it result in his, taking kids, for example, who engage in self-injurious behavior? Oftentimes, and again, part of that may be a learned process, but I'm sitting here, all of a sudden I smack myself in the head. What happens once I smack myself in the head? Okay? What are teachers and staff going to do? Is I start going, wow, wow, wow. Absolutely. All of a sudden, I've got all kinds of people with me. And what I find is that, gee, this is kind of a, and so it can become a way to engage social interaction. Okay? Now, I don't know, it also can get me out of tasks. So that behavior can serve multiple functions. Now, the fact that I have some sort of a biological issue that may have initially started the SIB kind of behaviors, I'm now looking to see how does this work for this kid. Does that make sense? So it doesn't answer, you can't just say, gee, it's impulsivity or it's this, and that's the function. That plays a role in perhaps why this is a problem, but the function still is going to be out there in terms of what I'm observing in terms of how this plays out for the child. Not every kid who has impulse control does it for immediate gratification. Some do it to escape. Okay. Does that make sense? No.
Yeah. Okay. I guess our paperwork doesn't say to obtain it, and I think that's where some of the wording is the type of forms that we have and what our choices are on our forms.
Yeah.
Well, the state forms are just changing. You're going to notice in your handout, we gave you a copy, and in the blue thing, the newsletter, which we've updated, which gives you do's and don'ts for the assessment and the BIP. You also have the updated forms, so your school district should be updating their forms because they've added the term to obtain or to avoid or to get or to avoid ahead of the four antecedents we're used to. It's just a little bit of a word change because sometimes you do try to avoid attention, for example, as opposed to always trying to get attention. So you'll notice that in your handouts as well.
And at the risk of violating the state form, always be careful that you don't become a slave to the form. We're trying to serve kids. And oftentimes I think I've seen schools in efforts to help effort, to make it easy. How many of you have gone into the IEPs where it has the accommodation page and it's just little check boxes? And what you find is that the parents and the IEP team then has checked damn near every box on that page. Because once it's there, the mom goes, well, I think that would be good, and that would be nice, and I think that would help, and we aren't good gatekeepers. And so we go, all right, okay. And pretty soon now this kid has 23 accommodations, and guess what? You got to do 23 accommodations. He doesn't need 23, he might need 2. Okay? So I see sometimes that we, in efforts to make forms user-friendly, we throw the baby out with the wash. Okay? So the form is supposed to drive the intervention. If this form isn't allowing you to get at the information that you need to develop the best intervention plan, think about talking about altering the form.
That's what you were talking about. Fortunately, that's what we did. We took out all the checkbox. We didn't. There isn't even a suggestion of what you should do. So what it does though is that it makes the form easier, because now you have to, as a team, decide what would be an appropriate intervention and write it in instead of doing that. You know what I mean? It's almost like we've simplified it even more. It sounds like we made it more complicated because now you have to think of it yourself instead of checking a box. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and it's off. I mean, forms are funny. I mean, they're a struggle. You know, it's. I wish there was a nice quickie. And I think the other problem is that there is not a clean set. Do these 5 things, and you've got an FBA. You know, a lot of it depends on the nature of the kid, the nature of the behavior. There are some things that I just, I'm not going to be, you'll never sit in front again, Dave. Dave engages in aggressive behavior. He's already smacked a teacher 3 times. Okay. Now it happens about once every 2 or 3 months. Am I going to sit and try to observe this? Okay? I'm never going to observe this, probably. I could spend an awful lot of time sitting in the classroom trying to wait for Dave to lose it. All right? It's too low rate of behavior that all the naturalistic observation things, at least from the standpoint of seeing Dave, seeing this target behavior, are probably not open to me. I've got to rely on other strategies. So, I mean, there's no kind of cut and dry, do these 5 things. There's a process that we go through. But and I think that's sometimes, I've read forms that, are very, very strong on the fact that I have somehow observed this classroom and this behavior multiple times. And in some cases, that's just not going to be the case. And so the form doesn't answer. I mean, always make sure that you're talking about the kid and the situation and not just trying to fill out the form.
Am I remembering this incorrectly? Tell me how this applies. At one point I remember reading something about if you have agreement among 3 or more sources, people working with the child as to what the function is, that
Hearing officers have, they're asking you to say, how did you verify the function? So if you go to a due process, you may hear a hearing officer say, what did you do to verify the function? One of the systems for verification is that you have 3 independent sources of data that all suggest the same function. So that could be 3 interviews, it could be an observation, an interview, and a review of the permanent products. Let's say I've got a kid who, we'll pick on somebody else here, we'll pick on Kim over here. When we find that Kim has really significant problems in math class, okay? So I might interview Kim, I might observe Kim, and then I might look at her math work, and lo and behold, Kim can't do this. All right, this work is way too, all I have to do is do an error analysis of her work, and I realize she can't do this work. When I talk to her, she says, you know what, math sucks, I'm not doing this shit, I hate the teacher, I hate everything about this place, all right, so there's some suggestion there that she'd like to get out of math, all right, and in my observation, all right, I've now got 3 independent sources that all seem to suggest this looks like an escape kind of a situation, all right, I'm good. Now, does that mean it's right? No. But hearing officers are generally saying if you can show where you had 3 sources of information that are truly independent, you've done an appropriate job. Okay? That means I can't get the 3 of you together and say, what do we think the problem is with Kim? All right, escape sound good to you? Joe? Yeah? Yeah? How about you, Melinda? Yeah? Dave? All right, good, let's make it escape. All right, our meeting's over, right? And I can say now, I'm talking with 3 teachers, they all said escape. Those aren't independent. All right, that's 1 source. It's not 3 sources.
Is that not independent because it's all 3 coming from teachers, or because we were
together? You were together. If you did it individually, it'd be fine.
Okay, so it could be 3 sources if they're all from teachers, but you spoke to everybody very independently.
Right.
Okay. Right. And that could just, for the sake of the working document, that could establish your function.
That could be your 3 sources. Now again, you've got to have a level of confidence. One of the problems is that teachers, one of the reasons they're asking for 3 is because none of our sources of data for this kind of process are particularly strong. I think that's one of the dilemmas, is that we've built a law saying that, we're going to do this, and quite frankly, when you go in and look at the, at how truly predictable some of the things that we use for data sources are to the, they're not particularly good. So teacher interviews aren't strong. That's why they want 3. So 3 would work, but in some cases, I might be a little happier not having just all teacher interview. I might like something else. But a lot of it depends. In other cases, quite frankly, folks, we've all seen kids who it's a slam dunk. Right? This is not a particularly tough kid. All right? I can look at what's going on. It's pretty clear what the function of this behavior is. I probably don't have to do 60 hours of work to figure out what the function is. Now, the other thing I could do with Kim is I could do what's called a functional analysis. And I think we talked about this once before. And that is that I can actually manipulate. A functional analysis manipulates what I suspect to be the function, whereas a functional assessment looks at the naturally occurring situation. So these are not interchangeable words. Oftentimes you'll see people use these as though it's the same process. It's not. In a functional analysis, I actually manipulate what I think is the variable to see how it impacts her behavior. So let's say I suspect that it's the level of difficulty of the math work, and that's why Kim acts out in math class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start altering the difficulty level. When the work gets easier, what should we see happening with Kim's behavior? It should go down. As the work becomes more difficult, her behavior problem should escalate. If it doesn't, then my function's not correct. All right? And I have to think of something else. So I could say, based on a functional analysis in which I manipulated the level of difficulty, Kim's behavior appears to be escape, boom, 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 and off I go. Or based on my observation of Kim during math on April 3rd, my interview with a teacher, and my review of her work, the function of Kim's behavior appears to be escape.
I have a question. We have a couple of students that we're doing interventions on, but we haven't written anything up. Like when you decide, like, a teacher comes to you or there's an issue and you're like, okay, we'll just do an intervention. Like I have a behavior replacement intervention in a classroom. When do I decide that, or, now we're coming up to his IEP and we're actually kind of thinking about maybe a change of placement, not because of behavior, but due to level of educational functioning, cognitive functioning. And now I'm like, oh, maybe I should have written up a like, how do you, when do you...
Yeah, if you're moving towards a different placement, yeah, you probably should have had a plan in place, okay?
But even though the change of placement is not due to
behavior? Well, all I can tell you is, and I wish it was really clear. The law basically talks about two times in which a functional assessment needs to be completed. One is if you have not done one prior to the 10th day of suspension, you need to do one, okay? Most schools are very clear about that, and they're very clean about that. There are very few schools that a kid is approaching that 10th day of suspension that there's not a functional assessment and a behavior intervention plan in place. The other place in the law, and this is the more vague one, talks about if a student with special needs behavior interferes with his learning or the learning of others, he is supposed to have a behavior intervention plan. Now, how many of you have kids with special needs whose behavior does not interfere with their learning and the learning of others? Okay? So now the issue, that's a little less clean because there's not like a number or when do I say it interferes and to what level does it have to interfere to hit some sort of a test of saying it's time now to do something, okay? That's really pretty vague, and that becomes the issue that if in a due process or someplace else you would be fighting that. I didn't put one in because it really wasn't interfering to the point that it had an adverse effect on the student's ability to succeed or the other student's ability to succeed. You're going to have to define why you think it did or did not have an adverse effect, those kinds of issues. And that behavior intervention plan is supposed to be informed by a functional assessment of the behavior. So my gut level would be to say, if you've got a kid whose behavior is pretty significant, this is a pretty limiting factor in terms of what's going on, or he is disruptive to the point that it truly does interfere with the learning of other kids, probably safer to put one in. Okay? Yes?
I have difficulty with the 10-day suspension thing, because if we have a student that's suspended because he brought a weapon to school, it was his first time, you know, show off, you know, with our deaf students that are a little low functioning, everything's about, you know, following what everyone else is doing. You have a student that brings a weapon to school, suspended for 10 days, sometimes, most of the time they're expelled, but, you know, they can be lenient on a first time. Okay, write a BIP. Okay, so you write a functional assessment on a kid who's don't bring guns to school. I have a hard time with that, because, you know, this is not a continuous behavior. It's not, you know, he's a good kid. He's like a straight A kid in his class. And, you know, he just did something completely stupid, and he just, you know, and then I'm supposed to write an FBA, don't bring a gun to school. And then a BIP. Okay, write a BIP. Like, okay, so that's where we have difficulty with. One kid brought an ounce of pot to school. Okay, don't bring drugs. But he's a perfectly good kid. We don't have behavioral problems with that particular kid.
Okay. Part of the issue is that, and you're right, if you're skipping the part of the function, that's going to be a problem. Okay, now, by law, if I get to the 10-day, I'm going to have an FBA and a BIP. That's just, you know, IDEA 1997 and reauthorized in 2004. That's just going to happen. Now, one of the first things I would do is probably talk with the administration and say, maybe we shouldn't just have a knee-jerk reaction of a 10-day suspension, no matter what. Okay, maybe we should take some things into consideration here, and if nothing else, have them read Russ Skiba and Peterson. Can't think of his first name. Research on zero tolerance. I mean, there's basically no significant support for zero tolerance. So this whole idea that we're going to have this knee-jerk reaction of 10 days kind of a thing, maybe we need to think about that. Because if they go to 10 days, they're going to do an FBA and a BIP. All right? Now, the FBA and the BIP isn't just don't bring guns. The FBA and the BIP would be a situation of saying, why do I think he brought the gun? Was it because he needed to show off, and so I want to feel like I'm cool, and I'm bringing the gun because look at this nice shiny thing with the pearl handles. This is pretty cool. What's the function of my bringing a gun? Okay. Yeah, I want some peer affiliation, peer attention. If I'm bringing it because I'm tired of being name-called and teased and taunted because I've got a hearing impairment, I'm bringing this gun because I'm going to blast somebody's butt if they give me any more trouble. Okay. That's a whole other function. Okay. If I'm in one of these,
they wouldn't be back in our school.
Then and you've got the same. I mean, you've got competing laws here for weapons and drugs. You've got IDEA 1997, but you've also got the Safe and Drug-Free Schools Act. So you've got competing laws that are trying to accomplish different things in the school. One, quite frankly, doesn't have a whole lot of concern for the child who brings the weapon or the drugs. It has concern for the rest of the people. The FBA BIP has concern for the child who you're developing the program for. So you've got some competing issues that you're going to have to think about clarifying and looking at what's going on and talking with the powers that be. But oftentimes, I mean, yeah, if I bring a gun, I mean, you were a speech and language kid or something, you brought a gun in, this is the first time. It may never ever happen again. I may never be worried that it would happen again, but I've got to do an FBA and a BIP. Now, in most cases, the kid is going to be out of school for, and how long do I have to develop this FBA and BIP?
10 days.
Yeah. How long is he gone? 10 days. In some cases, 45, right? The school's actually asked for a 45-day placement someplace because the kid's dangerous. I'll never ever see this kid back in the school that he's actually done this activity in at the time I've got to develop this FBA and BIP. All right.
I mean, I understand, like, you know, we have gang affiliation, you know, that kind of a thing, yes, we do, because that's continuous behavior. But then, you know, you have a kid, you know, we have a kid who got suspended for brass knuckle, you know, bringing it to school to show his friends. You know, it's like a one-time behavior, and then we're doing an FBA and the BIP, and then you never see it again, and so that just stays in his file.
What should the BIP be focusing on for a kid like that?
Why did he do the action?
They thought he was trying to impress his friends.
And he's low. His IQ is 50.
Okay.
So we're writing up some interventions that may help him figure out more appropriate ways to receive peer attention.
Okay.